The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, and welcome to today's edition of the Canadian Tree Fund webinar series. Today's presentation is Public Perception of Urban Forests in the Greater Toronto Area, presented by Camilo Barona. Camilo's work is related to the social and ecological aspects of urban nature and how people and nature influence each other, with a focus on urban forests and trees. Camilo helps cities become more resilient and livable through the management of urban forests. Originally from Cali, Colombia, he has worked in North America, Europe, Latin America, and Australia. Thanks for presenting today, and take it away.
Thank you very much, guys, and thank you so much for that introduction. I appreciate it, and thank you all for being here today, and thank you to the Canadian Tree Fund for the opportunity to present the research that we do. My name is Camilo Ordónez. I'm a researcher at the University of Toronto in the Geography Department, and I'm going to tell you some stories about how people, or some people, perceive the urban forests in the Greater Toronto Area. Whenever I give a presentation, I always like to mention that I'm a person who stutters. That means that sometimes the words don't come out as I would like them to come out, and I hope you're patient with me. The work that I present today is not just mine. It's the result of a collaboration with a lot of people, a lot of organizations and institutions, some of which are listed here. And I just want to acknowledge the contributions of all these people and all these organizations and the work that we do. Understanding and incorporating people's perception of urban forests is critical to the success of urban forest programs, and fundamental to understand the range of human experiences with urban nature and the pathways that connect those experiences with human well-being and with health. This is a very good example of why that is. Some researchers in the city of Detroit went out and did some interviews with the people who rejected a tree being planted in front of their house that was part of a very, very ambitious street tree planting program in that city. And what they found is that, and I'm so sure that a few people who are attending this webinar today have heard this expression before. They heard this expression a lot. They have nothing against trees, but which means that, you know, in their findings, in all these interviews and these conversations with all these residents that rejected a tree, they held very positive perceptions of trees, but they had very negative perceptions about the maintenance that was done to these trees. And they didn't really trust the organizations and institutions that were in charge of planting these trees or just maintaining them or just generally making decisions about these trees. Because this presentation is about how people perceive trees or perceive things that are related to trees, there are three considerations that I think are critical when we talk about these things. What are we perceiving exactly? How are we perceiving that thing? Because we perceive things in many different ways. And who is perceiving those things? This is kind of the fluffy part, or the very, very heavy social sciences part of the presentation. So please bear with me while I go through some of these concepts and ideas. So we have some experience from the real world with the trees and the forest and nature in cities in general. And then we try to make sense from those experiences by developing ideas, or what we call cognitions, and processing those cognitions in particular ways, making sense of those experiences with the real world. And those ideas that we have, you know, embedded in our brain are going to translate in how we behave and the effects that we get from those experiences and those processes. So, but let us unpack a bit of what happens inside people's heads when they process those experiences from the real world with those cognitive processes. Well, they develop perceptions, right? And perceptions are very diverse. Some perceptions are very static or constant, fundamental. And other perceptions are very numerous, very specific, and very variable. They can change through time. Some perceptions tend to perceptions at a higher level of abstraction tend to influence perceptions at a lower level of abstraction. This is what they call the cognitive hierarchy of how people think about stuff or how people perceive things. And that's all fine and great from a theoretical perspective, but what does that specifically mean? When I pose the question to somebody of how do you perceive that tree, probably how we tend to respond to that question is like, well, that tree is kind of nice, or some people may say that it's a bit thin, it doesn't look very healthy perhaps, or they may say that they don't like that particular tree of that particular species, or they don't like where it is located. These are very numerous, very specific perceptions that are at a lower level of abstraction that tend to be very variable, because trees, of course, find themselves in different contexts, and we perceive those different contexts and trees in many different ways. But if I pose the question, how do you perceive all the trees in a city, the whole collection of trees in a city, what we conceive to be as the urban forest of the city, then people are going to share with us some perceptions that are at a higher level of abstraction, that will probably be more fundamental, that are going to describe the deep ideas and things that they think about trees in general and forests in general. A very important consideration when we study perception is who is perceiving these things. And there's a bit of research around how is this being treated in the literature currently, and psychologists especially seem to be very worried about where they get their data from, what kinds of people with what kind of demographic kind of characteristics participate in some of the studies. And you can see from this work by Medin et al. that in many psychological studies, people kind of seem to fit a very particular demographic profile. Of course, this is not generally in social sciences, because, as you know, social sciences can also involve sociological or anthropological studies. But the study of cognition and perception is definitely being driven by a lot of social psychology studies. So why do we study perceptions? What is the rationale of why this is important? Studying perceptions help us understand the why, the what, the why, and the how communities think about trees. It helps us enhance the range of benefits that we consider, that we make the decisions about, that we provide to the communities that we serve. They help us understand human nature processes, because they are an intrinsic part of how people experience nature in cities. From a management perspective or a planning perspective, they help us set an account for the priorities that people have. And from a broader perspective, a very philosophical perspective, I guess, they help us engage people more with nature and help to enhance this interaction that people have with nature. So this research was driven by the following questions. What are the perceptions that people have in relation to the urban forests in the Greater Toronto area? But we had to consider with a lot of clarity and a lot of intention, we had to consider the diversity of places, the diversity of people, and the diversity of perceptions that people held. In this presentation in particular, I'm going to focus on the diversity of perceptions that people have and how these perceptions relate to each other. The approach that we had, we did what we called an urban rural gradient research design. So we try to collect data from people living in different parts of the Greater Toronto area in order to get a good geographical spread. And we use what they call an online panel survey, which has a lot of advantages. It's a fast way to collect data from people through an online survey. And you do it through a panel of people. So panelists are members of a panel that are managed by a marketing company. And these panels are set to be balanced for many of the demographic profiles, like level of income, gender, and things like that. So we deliver the online survey to people who are living in the postal codes around those selected areas that you see. As you can see, we had to subdivide some of the cities that were very big, and we had to join some of the cities that were very small. But but overall, the goal was to get a good geographical representation across the city. One of the questions that we included in the survey is that how people consider urban forests important. This is a values-based question because it goes into this kind of high level of abstraction ideas that people have about the urban forest. And this question was included 16 different valued things about the urban forest. And these 16 things grouped into 4 main, you can call them value or orientations if you want. And one of them was about natural things about the urban forest that people value, things related to the identity of the city or the identity of people, social things that people value, and cultural things that people value. So those are the 4 main ideas about why people consider urban forests important, but they reflect very complex, a very wide range of ideas that people have. In terms of how these different values were ranked, I guess, or were assessed across the different cities in the GTA that we explored. You can see it here, and you can see it here as well, visualized by the different categorizations of cities that we have. So from downtown areas to kind of outside areas of the GTA, and what we call regional cities. So cities that are small towns that are kind of tied into the metropolitan area, but are not really part of that same space. We included a question also about how people thought about the negative and the positive consequences of having urban trees. And lots of people have done this kind of work. So what we did was we integrated as many ideas as we could from previous research, and we developed these 26 things that people consider positive or negative. 13 of those were negative things that people think about trees, and 13 of those were positive things that people think about trees. The negative things kind of grouped together really well. So whenever people had very negative opinions about trees, they had them in kind of the same way. And when they had positive opinions about trees, they had those positive opinions about trees in the same way. So in some ways, these 13 things were measuring the same idea. Some of the other measures that we included in the survey included satisfaction with trees, satisfaction with management of trees, the trust that people have in the institutions or the organizations that were in charge of the management of trees or making decisions about trees. This, of course, refers to city governments or local governments. And we had a question about of how much money people were willing to give for the urban forest as a tax contribution. And this was about, for one individual, for one person, this was about $32 per year, which is kind of reflects similar patterns from previous studies around willingness to pay for trees in cities. So what do we do with this information? One of the things that we really wanted to understand is how all these perceptions were related to each other. You know, how certain values kind of result in certain beliefs, and how those certain beliefs result in certain level of satisfaction that people have with trees and management, and how those things relate to knowledge and the trust that they have in public institutions and so on. Considering, of course, socio-ecological context factors like the cultural diversity that people have, the demographics that people have. And one of the most important factors, I think, that has been studied before is whether people have a tree in front of their home. So when you use this data and you do a statistical model to test these relationships, what you get is this kind of really messy graph, which of course is horrendogram. So what we do is that we try to simplify this graph and tell you to tell them a much more simple story about how these things relate to each other. So one of the storylines is that And you can see here the positive and the negative relationships that these things have. One of the storylines is that people who hold strong cultural values tend to have more negative beliefs than people who hold natural values or social values about trees. In fact, people who hold natural values and social values about trees tend to have more positive beliefs about trees. And people who have very strong natural values tend to have more knowledge about trees. So that's one of the storyline. The second storyline is that people who have very strong positive beliefs about trees, they seem to be more satisfied with the trees, but less satisfied with how these trees are managed. In some ways, if you really like trees, you don't necessarily trust the city to manage these trees very well. The other storyline is that if you really like trees because of their natural and cultural values, you don't tend to be so satisfied about what you find in the city, the types of trees that you find in the city. So this question about satisfaction, how satisfied people are with their trees, raises some ideas about, raises this quite important question, do more trees result in more satisfaction with their trees or with the management of those trees? So in some ways, we can pose that satisfaction can be a way to measure the performance of urban forestry within city. And here I refer to some of the work that Carly Cedar has been doing in the city of Montreal, where we know that trees are only evenly distributed across the city. Some parts of the cities have less trees, some part of the cities have more trees. Usually this is very correlated with the level of income of some neighborhoods. And of course, people are going to get less benefits if they don't have trees, and more benefits when they have lots of trees. But this raises the questions, does that also mean that they're going to be more satisfied with their trees? So theoretically, you could say that there's this strong, or that we expect this strong correlation. When you have a lot of trees, you're very satisfied. But the fact, when you plug in these data together with just the city data, this is just the canopy cover for the whole city and the level of satisfaction for the whole city. So it's very, really coarse relationship. We don't really see that up to a certain point or to a certain threshold. We see a strong relationship between satisfaction and canopy cover, but after that certain threshold, that kind of doesn't hold true. In some ways, providing more trees may not necessarily change the perceptions that people have about how satisfied they are with the trees or satisfied with their management. And you see no relationship at all with the level of income. And this is, once again, really coarse, just the level of income at the city level. But we see no relationship with the level of income of the city and the level of satisfaction of trees for that city. Of course, this raises issues that we need to go beyond these really coarse associations and really try to derive more specific data at the level of specific people. So one of the things that we want to do with this data in the future is try to correlate it to how many trees people see from their house. And this is a new idea that some researchers have been developing, what they call the tree view index, from a particular location. How much greenery do you see, or how many trees do you see? And one of the ideas that we have with some of our colleagues working in Montreal and Vancouver is to replicate these surveys to see if these patterns of perceptions about urban forests work as well in different contexts and environments across Canada. So we have collected very neat data on how people perceive trees. And one of the most important messages that this data are saying is that what people consider important is not necessarily the most frequent idea or common idea or most immediate idea that people have about trees. Perception is really complex. How people value trees or how people value the forest is a very complex issue, and people perceive trees and forests in very different ways. And of course, the values they hold, the beliefs that they hold, the level of trust and satisfaction and knowledge, these things are all part of the mix that help us understand better how people perceive their urban forest. And one of the last points that I have is that culture is a very powerful force, regardless of differences in the environment, of the types of trees or the types of cities. People tend to have, people of a particular demographic and of a particular background, of course, tend to have very similar ideas about trees or perceive things in very fundamental ways. Of course, some perceptions will change and will vary, but some more abstract, more fundamental perceptions may perhaps replicate across cities. Thank you very much for participating in this webinar today, and thank you once again to the Canadian Tree Fund for the opportunity to present this research. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing from you guys and to respond to some questions. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that presentation. Folks who are listening to the webinar and have questions, there's a drop-down menu on your screen there that allows you to send some questions into the chat. The very first one that comes in is, are you able to expand on the cognitive hierarchy? Is there an example of how high level influences low level?
Yeah, so that was part of my, thank you for the question. That's a very neat question. So that was part of this little model that we have where we try to relate these perceptions, higher or more abstract perceptions like values, how are they related with, still abstract, but not as abstract perceptions, such as beliefs about the positive and negative consequences of trees, and then kind of lower level of abstraction perceptions like the satisfaction that people have with their trees, which kind of reflects a bit the preferences that people have of the trees, because when you look at how that measure of satisfaction with trees, what that measure of satisfaction with trees is, you can see that we have included how people are satisfied with the diversity of their trees, the nativeness of the trees, the quantity of their trees. So there's a lot of different things that try to assess the level of preference that people have with trees. And those things are related in some way to those higher level abstraction or perceptions that we tend to call values and beliefs. Of course, these relationships may be different from city to city or from person to person, of course. And part of the research is trying to understand how, where they differ, why and how do they differ across cities and different environments and different contexts. But this is what we find in the Greater Toronto Area when you just take the whole data set and try to account for the variability of context and variability of people as well.
And there's a follow-up question in the chat about that asks, on the question of kind of more trees, more satisfaction, are you able to guess why there may be a limit to satisfaction, or why satisfaction levels off after a certain point?
That's a very good question. This is where my response may get a little bit philosophical, but speculative as well. First of all, let me say that we don't know why that happens, and we don't know whether this happens across contexts. We cannot really say that because we haven't conducted the same type of studies across contexts. But one of the things that we saw very similar patterns from Australia, because I kind of did a very similar work in Melbourne, Australia, with a very similar survey. And we did it last year in the Greater Toronto Area, and we saw very similar patterns. But these are very coarse patterns. This is just satisfaction level for the whole city and canopy cover level for the whole city. And across the metropolitan area, this is the pattern that you have. But we don't really know if this pattern holds true when you collect more specific data at kind of the level of people, which is what we want to do in the future with this idea of tree view index. But why does that occur? Well, and this was one of the ideas that I had about culture. People's experiences with urban nature, with trees or forests, they are very complex. And sometimes when you think about values and what is important to people, some of those perceptions and some of those ideas tend to be very fundamental. They don't change that easy. They do change through times, perhaps through generation or throughout the lifetime of one person, but they may not fundamentally change regardless of how many things happen outside that person. People tend to hold true to their more fundamental or more abstract perceptions about how they value things. But of course, some perceptions may change as well. Some preferences may change. People would like to see more trees here and less trees there, these types of tree, more and less of that type of tree. But the more fundamental perceptions about how they value trees or what they believe about trees may not necessarily change, regardless of what you provide to them or how you try to account for those preferences.
Very interesting. Thank you. And there's a follow-up question as well to that about if you're able to discuss how we can kind of use these values to tell particular stories about trees. For example, should municipalities send communication assuring residents that trees will be maintained?
Yeah, so this idea about maintenance and people being satisfied for the maintenance of trees, or the maintenance that city governments do on their trees, and this idea of whether they trust their institutions or not. Yeah, I mean, it is very important to maintain trees throughout the lifetime of the tree, of course. If we are to provide the benefits that trees provide, we need to make sure that those trees remain healthy. Of course, there's a very long conversation here about the resources that cities have to maintain the trees that they plant. Sometimes they have lots of money one year to plant a lot of trees, and then 5 years later, they just don't get the money or the resources to maintain those trees that they planted, and maybe half of those trees die because they couldn't go out there to water them or to take care of them. So there's a very big conversation here about the resources that cities have to make sure that they maintain them properly. But there's a big conversation here as well of how do you make sure that people trust in what you're doing. And sometimes you can communicate very well with the community and come up with strong agreements with that community that you are going to maintain what you're planting and what you're doing. And that may address some of these issues about lack of trust and lack of satisfaction with management. But you may want to consider as well that this thing about trust is far more complicated than just what cities do to their trees. There's a long story. Some communities have a very long story of distrust or mistrust with governments or some organizations and some institutions because of lots of inequities and discrimination issues that have been going on for a long time. So it's far more complicated than just the trees. But when people think about trees, these more fundamental and deeper things that they feel about these organizations and institutions get reflected in what they say when they're expressing their ideas about trees.
And Edgar asks a question that relates to that, saying that do you think there's a difference between difference in perceptions between Latin American citizens and Toronto citizens?
That's a very good point. That just makes me want to do more research on this because there's not a lot of social sciences studies that study perception of people in Latin American cities. There are a few, but not a lot. If you tell me to count how many there are, we did a literature review actually a couple of years ago of all the research on urban forestry in Latin America. And we could only find 17 social science studies, 17 from like 200 studies. So yeah, there's not a lot. And the research that is there is of course very different because people think about they're testing for different types of perceptions and they're testing for different ideas. So it's very varied and very complex. But I would be very interested in doing this type of research in Latin American cities and really understand the deep and not so deep perceptions that people have with their urban forest and compare it with the work that we're doing here in Canada and see, how how would it be similar or how it would be different? And when it is different, why does that occur?
On the topic of kind of this cultural appreciation or perception of trees and how it kind of intertwines with both one's own perception of trees, but also kind of a larger societal or group think. How do you suggest navigating issues when people want trees that, from an urban forest management perspective, we know that we shouldn't necessarily plant, like invasive species or monoculture species or vulnerable species like ash?
So there are two parts of the question here. Can we generalize across populations? And very quickly, just to address this issue of generalization across populations, one thing is that, yes, you can when you have the data. But the second thing is that most of the time you don't have the data to make those broad generalizations. Like I said, there's a lot of social psychologists that are now saying that, you know, the data that we derive from people come from people with a particular demographic profile. And one of the research studies that I'm part of right now is we're trying to assess all the empirical social science research that has been done on people's perceptions of trees in cities and trying to assess the demographic profile of these studies to see how they reflect general populations and how do they reflect the diversity of these populations, because people are, of course, very diverse. And how you clearly and intentionally address that diversity that we have, of course, is going to make your research more or less generalizable. But of course, you don't necessarily want to generalize all the time, because particular communities have very specific perceptions of trees that you want to account for, and those perceptions of trees have their value. People are very diverse, like I say, and we all relate to trees or forests in different ways, and trying to account for that diversity is extremely important. But in terms of the preferences, you know, whether people like this tree or that tree, there is some research that says that people like a particular type of tree, a particular savanna-looking tree, as they call it the savanna theory. Trees that have very broad canopies that grow in a savanna environment, those are the types of trees. The serious trees, usually, those are the types of trees that people like. Once again, this research has been driven by people from a particular demographic profile, so it may not generalize to the whole planet. And people in different communities and in different places may like different types of trees. So you want to account for this diversity because, you know, nature comes very diverse as well. And you want to account for the diversity of nature and the diversity of preferences that people have with that nature. So coming up with a big, you know, one of the biggest motivations of doing this kind of research is, oh, let's come up with the one size fits all solution to the perfect type of tree that people want. And we may not necessarily get there because, like I say, nature is very diverse and people are very diverse, and we experience and perceive things in very diverse way. So just trying to plant diverse tree palettes, as they say, or tree species palettes, is, I think, one of the big ideas here.
On the topic of the slide you're on right now, for tree view index, canopy cover from an urban forest management perspective, pretty straightforward to measure and also to monitor, whereas the tree view index seems to, you know, apart from more complex AI-driven analysis of Google Street View or something like that, it seems to take a lot more of the survey-based research. Do you think that the tree view index is going to start to come in a lot more to urban forest management and start to replace the canopy cover metrics and canopy cover goals that we use?
Well, first of all, I'm not the best person to respond to this question because I am not an expert in this type of metrics or this type of data processing. We want to collaborate with people who are quite the experts on this, but we are not. So I think I would send me an email and I would refer to you to some of the people that are better placed to respond to this type of questions. But the second thing that I want to say is that I don't necessarily like the word replacing something for something else. You know, all different metrics have their own problems and caveats and, you know, advantages and great things. And canopy cover or tree numbers or tree diversity or functional diversity or tree views, you know, those different metrics can help us get a better understanding of what's going on with the community and what's going on with the trees. And as long as we continue to work on diversifying these types of metrics, I think it's better for the work that we do and how we make the decisions about trees and how we manage things. So it may not necessarily replace canopy cover measures, but hopefully it would complement some of the caveats that these canopy cover measures have.
Thank you very much. Another question that chats is kind of the negative beliefs surrounding trees. And it seems like there may be an opportunity to address those negative beliefs. So is it possible to change people's negative perceptions around trees, for example, blocking the sun from a garden? You know, it's true on a micro level, but on a more macro level, there certainly are benefits. We know that ecosystem services generally outweigh the ecosystem disservices of urban trees. So how can we reach residents with information like this and help them consider the positives and encourage tree planting?
Yeah, that's a very good point. And it is the negative beliefs that people have about trees that sometimes is the obstacle that cities face to make better decisions about trees, to reflect the desires or the priorities of their community in the decisions that they make themselves. And trying to address these very strong negative beliefs that people have is very important, because sometimes on the basis of those negative beliefs, people want to get rid of their trees, particularly in a residential kind of private property context. People just want to get rid of all the trees because they're afraid, because they attract bushfires or wildfires. They attract animals. They're messy. They use lots of water. You know, they're ruining the pipes of my house, and so on and so forth. Right? How do we address these things? And it is very important to communicate in different ways with different people to address these negative beliefs, of course, but we need to accept as well that sometimes these negative beliefs are very entrenched, and we may not be able to completely change the mindset of this person about these negative beliefs. But what we can do is really try to be more positive about the positive things that trees do to them, that are complementary, I guess, to some of those negative things that people think about trees. But of course, from a technical perspective, I guess it's extremely important to tell people that tree is not necessarily going to fall on their house. That tree has a good structural health. Let's leave it there, keep it there. Or maybe, you know, let's just plant smaller trees. Let's plant the type of tree that you want to have, that makes you feel safer, that makes you feel more positive. Because, you know, nature comes, like I say, in many different ways, and we can grow trees in many different ways to satisfy people, regardless of the negative beliefs that they have.
How important do you think it is to for urban forest managers and arborists to recognize the negative ecosystem disservices and be kind of public in talking about how there are these negative disservices and kind of methods around them, but at least acknowledging that they exist?
They do exist, and trying to acknowledge that they exist is extremely important, because it's part of the narrative that people have, right? A lot of the research on people's perception of urban trees only tends to focus on the positive things, but there is a narrative here about the negative things that is really important. And far more important, I think, is where do those negative beliefs come from? And this is why we are trying to test these relationships between negative beliefs and the values that people hold and the trust and the satisfaction with trees, because you can address those negative beliefs by talking to people about the different values, reasons of importance of trees, by talking to them about trusting the city, by talking to them about satisfaction with trees, by giving them more knowledge about trees. So you can address these negative beliefs in various ways, not just necessarily that directly, but you can do it in a more indirect way by changing your communication strategy and maybe talking more about natural values or talking more about cultural values, because like I said, there's a strong positive relationship between cultural values and negative beliefs. And perhaps a narrative here would be talking about the cultural values that trees provide in order to address some of those negative beliefs that people have.
Edgar asks a question in the chat that kind of is along that pathways of perception, that asks that the ornamental vision of the urban tree has defined its management as kind of limited to pruning, felling, and transplanting, at least in Latin America. And how can we change this perception and kind of discuss with the public and add to their perception that there's many services and benefits that trees provide in an urban context?
How do you do it? Two ways, right? You can try to tell people about what you do and why trees are important far more than the technical things that they provide, or you make decisions about trees that are far more complex than just the technical things that people think about. So communicating these things to the public. But also a very good way of addressing this is just talking to your communities, studying your communities, engaging your communities, and having strong relationship with your communities in order to understand what these communities want. What do they think about trees? What do they want from their trees? And trying to include those ideas, to represent those ideas in the decisions that you make and the strategies or plans that you create around these trees that go far beyond obviously just pruning, planting, and replacing, and cutting down branches and or selecting the right type of trees, which are very key decisions to make about trees, but are not necessarily the whole range of decisions that city governments in particular or different stakeholders that deal with trees, decisions that they take.
Great, thank you very much. Are you able to expand on the online survey method that you used and how you disseminated it, like social media or targeted ads? Or
no, I didn't use social media. I use a marketing company. We used a marketing company that marketing companies have panels, and panelists are members of those panels. So a marketing company may have access to, like Gallup or something like that would be a good example of a global panel company or marketing company. They may have access to, say, 20 million people in the US. Canada is a smaller country, of course, so maybe they have access to, say, 5 million people or 2 million people or 1 million people. Different panels serve different purposes. Sometimes it's a nationwide study, sometimes they're very local, they're very focused at the provincial level, or they're very focused at the city level. So we use the panel companies. We talked to a lot of panel companies, and we used the panel companies that could provide us with enough data and with enough panelists within the places, within the cities that we were targeting. So we told them, we need 2,000 people from the city. Do you have them? Yes, we have them. Do you have them located in these different postal codes? Yes, we have them. So we selected a marketing company that of course could provide the service that we wanted, and then we sent them the post. We did this geographical selection or the sign of postal codes and parts of the city, and then we sent it to them, and we collected enough data from all the cities. One of the things that you need to consider, obviously, when doing this kind of geographical representative panel survey approach is that in some parts, in some geographical contexts and areas, you're not going to have enough panelists. So you need to compensate, say, in this map, just on the basis of this map, say you have just 50 panelists within Georgina, but you need 100 from that type of city or that city. Then you have to join cities or join spaces, join geographical areas, so you can collect enough data from a similar city or from a similar space. And that's why we had to join some of the smaller municipalities in the GTA that are in the kind of the peripheral part of the metropolitan area. We had to join them because we just didn't have enough data from panel. We just didn't have enough panelists in these spaces, so we had to join them in order to collect enough data from these spaces. Whereas you have lots of panelists from downtown Toronto, but you don't want your data set to be dominated by people from downtown Toronto, because of course you're trying to very intentionally and very clearly address this issue of different contexts or diversity in context. Right? The other thing that I have to say is that panel surveys, you have to pay obviously for the panel surveys, and the panel companies, they use part of this money to obviously manage your project, but also part of the money to pay for the panelists to respond to your survey. And that varies. That may be somewhere between $3 to $10 per response, depending on the type of panel survey you're running.
Great, thank you very much. To wrap it up here, because we're out of questions, but you have a tree removal project that you're working on right now, and what type of tree removals are you looking for, and how can folks who are attending here today get in touch with you for more info?
Thank you for reminding me. Yeah, so we have a tree removal project where we're trying to find tree removal events, significant tree removal events around the GTA. And also we're studying the city of Montreal as well. So if you're aware of any tree removal events in those two contexts, let us know. I would be very happy to learn about them. Please send me an email about them. And the idea of this finding about tree removal events is that we want to use these events as a way to measure the effect of removing trees from an ecological or biodiversity perspective and from a social perspective. So how do people change, or people's ideas change, or their brains change, or their behavior changes when you remove trees around them, and how the biodiversity around that space changes when you remove trees. So if you know of a very significant tree removal event happening around you or in your city, please send me an email, and I would be very happy to connect with you and learn more about these events.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And that brings us to the end there then. So, as Bridget just sent in the chat for all the attendees here today, if you attended live here, we'll submit your CUs for you automatically. You don't need to do anything, and they'll appear in your ISA account if you're with the ISA. Before we go as well, as always, the Canadian Tree Fund is hugely appreciative of any donations that folks send in. We're not for profit, and so any donations over $20 receive a tax receipt. So if you perhaps saved yourself a chainsaw chain this year and have $20 or more for your company that you want to donate, we will gladly put it to good use towards research in arboriculture and urban forestry across Canada. I've just sent the donation URL there in the chat, and we're again hugely appreciative of anything that you can donate, and rest assured that it'll be put towards good use through our grants and scholarship programs. With that, I'd like to thank Camilo for joining us today, the ISAO as always for running this, and thank you to all the attendees for joining us here today. We didn't say this at the start, but this is the anniversary of the first one that we ran on May 4th with also on Toronto, tree planting in Toronto with Amory and Ian. So coming full circle back again to Toronto, and looking forward to another year of Canadian Tree Fund webinars. So thanks, Camilo. Thanks, everyone, for joining us, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, guys. Thanks a lot for coming, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, everyone.